The Empire of Japan extended over almost an entire hemisphere of the globe between 1942 and 1945. But once the war ended, what happened to those millions of Japanese soldiers who were guarding that vast empire? Do you already know the answer to that question? If not, stick around to find out. And before we start this very special video, I have an even more special announcement to make for you. You've been asking me for this for a really long time. A more structured content than the videos we usually post more casually here on the channel on YouTube, right? And to really learn the content in a way that helps you professionally or even with your passion for the history of World War I created the Sustainable Development Goals Academy over there at the Academy. You will be able to take our courses, get certified by them, and have the guarantee that you will really make progress in your knowledge about military history of World War I and also other conflicts. And our first course is really the most requested of all, Strategy and Tactics on the Map. Think like the generals of World War II, which will cover the European and North African campaigns in World War II between 1939 and 1945. If you're interested in joining the pioneering class of the Sustainable Development Goals Academy, hurry up and click the link in the description. It was on that day that Emperor Hirohito announced on Japanese radio that the country would surrender for the first time in its millennial history. And that decision, made back in Tokyo, literally affected the lives of millions of people who were also literally spread across half the world. An entire hemisphere, the Asian and Pacific hemisphere, which was filled with Japanese possessions that hadn't been attacked at that moment. Consider the vast expansion the Japanese achieved for their empire, which in 1945 mostly still remained under their control. There were millions of Japanese soldiers spread across China, Manchuria, here in Burma, in French Indochina, in Indonesia, and so on. Dutch, which was called the Dutch East Indies at the time, and throughout this region of the Central Pacific. Now, given an area of this size here, I'm going to give you a fact that I'm sure you didn't know. Until the day of the Japanese surrender, do you know how many Japanese prisoners the Allies had in their hands? The grand total was 38,666 men. Just to give you a basic idea for comparison, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, a single infantry division that fought in Italy, captured a total of 20,000 prisoners over 9 months of campaigning. In other words, the Far East Brigade alone captured a number equivalent to more than half of the total Japanese prisoners in Allied hands by the end of the war. And why were there so few Japanese prisoners? Because the act of surrendering was seen as extremely dishonorable within the Japanese military code. So every soldier preferred to take his own life, ideally taking an enemy soldier with him, rather than surrendering to the enemy. But once Japan signed its surrender, the Allies found themselves facing a huge problem. They would have to deal with no less than 3.7 million Japanese soldiers stationed abroad, as well as 3.2 million Japanese civilian soldiers who had been transported to those territories in the previous years, including public officials, settlers, specialists, technicians, and many other types of people. A total that reached 6.9 million Japanese who immediately needed repatriation. Besides these, there were still more. Hundreds of thousands of Japanese settlers were also scattered throughout this territory here and had served in support units of the Japanese armed forces. Although we know it's very clear that there's a need to repatriate Japanese soldiers, why would the American command have to repatriate Japanese civilians? Well, because it was the goal of the Allied High Command to dismantle the Japanese Empire, or all Japanese influence in this Asian hemisphere, here and in the Pacific. The leadership feared that if these people remained in these colonies, two things could happen. The first is that they would certainly become victims of reprisals. And several massacres throughout this entire area here could be expected in the following months. The second factor is that repatriating Japanese civilians would ease the administrative burden of all these territories, since basic goods like food were very scarce at that time. And now we have to talk about the central figure, the highest Allied authority in the Japanese occupation, General Douglas MacArthur. And already in his first days as head of the occupation in Tokyo, MacArthur faced a gigantic problem. The Japanese government presented him with a very complex situation, derived from their beliefs, from their doctrine. Being a prisoner of war was something extremely dishonorable for the Japanese soldier. So, the government proposed to reclassify those millions of soldiers who had fallen under Allied control. They would not then be prisoners of war. They would be a kind of surrendered contingent. It was just a semantic change, but it would be extremely important to avoid much greater harm to these men once they returned to Japan. MacArthur could have simply ignored this Japanese suggestion, but he had another problem on his hands that was directly related to this. The problem was that American soldiers, their families in the United States, and the entire political class in Washington were demanding immediate action from him for the repatriation of the American soldiers themselves. And we rarely talk about this, but there were, in fact, several large protests by American military personnel all over Asia demanding to be repatriated as quickly as possible now that the war was over. In this way, in the last months of 1945, MacArthur almost immediately lost 6 divisions of Marines that were repatriated home, and he was literally left without enough personnel to handle all the administrative issues in Asia and the Pacific. That's when he made a decision. The Japanese military would no longer be prisoners of war, according to the Geneva Convention, and would receive a new designation, Japanese surrendered personnel or Japanese surrendered personnel, something like Japanese surrendered contingent. And under this new categorization, the Japanese surrendered personnel could be used for auxiliary tasks by the Allied command itself. So both the repatriation of American soldiers and that of Japanese soldiers happened immediately after the announcement of the surrender, in September 1945. And this repatriation effort used all available ships, including Japanese ships. Even the warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy were immediately sent to operational shipyards in Japan, where they were completely disarmed and assigned to the task of transporting people back home. The Americans also assigned their Liberty ships to this task, the supply ships that had been built at a super accelerated pace during the war and had now been quickly converted into repatriation transport ships. The shortage of American personnel was so severe that many of these Liberty ships were even fully crewed by Japanese crews. Imagine this situation: a ship carrying thousands of Japanese soldiers back home, with a 100% Japanese crew taking them there. This heavy reliance on Japanese labor even affected areas outside the repatriation effort and the bureaucracy of the Allied occupation government itself. It was extremely dependent on the Japanese, and this made the American military occupation of Japan historically a smooth process. The Allied command really made a maximum effort to speed up the repatriation process between September 1945 and December 1946. Of the 6,900,000 Japanese who were abroad at the end of the war, no less than 5 million had already returned home. But hundreds of thousands of Japanese were held abroad by the Allied command during this period, especially those who had some kind of technical skill. In this curious photo here, taken in the last months of 1945, you can see a British jeep crossing a bridge, which is guarded by an armed Japanese soldier. And this extreme shortage of labor in the Pacific region led not only the British, but also the Americans, whose military justice system completely turned a blind eye to this process, all from Japanese surrendered personnel. They used thousands of these Japanese soldiers to perform routine tasks, such as construction, cleaning, and maintenance in the Philippines. 80,000 Japanese soldiers were used for these tasks until the end of 1946. All of this is very interesting, isn't it? But did you have any idea that besides these administrative tasks here, Japanese soldiers were also employed in combat by the Allies? Here's what I'll tell you now. The end of the war for the Japanese. It was full of interesting facts, right? There are some items in my collection you'll want to see. Check these out. These are ceremonial sake cups given as honorable discharge by the Japanese armed forces. This one here even came with the original box. Look how beautiful it is, man. Look at the Army and Navy flags. Look, this is a commemorative Navy one. All three are from the Navy, right? The soldier would receive a little sake cup like this one when he was honorably discharged from service. With the end of the war, the Supreme Allied Commander for Southeast Asia, Admiral Lord Lewis, Mountbatten, British, uncle of Prince Philip, husband of Queen Elizabeth of Uri, also had a big problem on his hands. Because of the commitments made by the Allied powers in Europe, Mountbatten, in addition to restoring order in the British colonies in the Pacific, would also have to administer the colonies of other European powers, such as the Netherlands and France, and it was precisely in the colonies of French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies that nationalist revolutions were breaking out, and he would have to deal with them. And remember that the soldiers who defended these territories until 1942 had spent 3 years in Japanese captivity and were now practically just skin and bones. Mountbatten had very few troops available to fight and contain the chaos that reigned in these territories. In the Dutch East Indies, a nationalist revolution broke out. In August 1945, right after the announcement of the Japanese surrender, in that territory, a contingent of 35,000 Japanese soldiers surrendered. But a good percentage of them were kept armed, in uniform, and using the same organization and officer corps that existed during the war, this time to contain Japanese infantry battalions. They fought the Indonesian revolutionaries on several occasions, most notably in the Battle of Semarang on October 14, 1945. The Japanese almost single-handedly held back the revolutionaries in that Indonesian city, and after 6 days had practically taken over the entire city. When British reinforcements arrived to assist them, the British dependence on Japanese military contingents in Indonesia was so great that in April, 1946 Mountbatten went to visit the island of Sumatra. And do you know what he said? Of course I knew that we had used armed Japanese troops to protect our lines of communication and our vital areas. Even so, it was a big shock for me to discover thousands of Japanese soldiers guarding the 15 kilometers of road, the airport, and the city. Another territory that saw significant Japanese involvement in post-war fighting was Vietnam. In this very curious photo here, you see Ho Chi Minh in 1945, flanked by American Office of Strategic Services officers, the precursor to the CIA. These American officers here were helping Ho Chi Minh at that time against the Japanese who were occupying the colony of Vietnam. But in the immediate post-war period, the Allied High Command allowed the surrender of Japanese troops in northern Vietnam to be handled by China, and in southern Vietnam to be handled by England. And in that order lies the seed of the historical process that would divide Vietnam into two nations in the years to come. When the Japanese surrender was announced, Douglas MacArthur forbade the British from occupying Vietnam, which was a French colony, until the Japanese formally signed the surrender. So that act, which lasted about 3 weeks, created a huge power vacuum in that territory. And the Japanese contingents that were in northern Vietnam simply opened their arsenals to Ho Chi Minh. And that's exactly why the armed group known as Viet Minh was born. And shortly after, Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of Vietnam. Right after the Japanese government signed the formal surrender in Tokyo Bay, with independence declared, he then set out to occupy the country's largest population centers, including Saigon, down in southern Vietnam. And when they finally got there, the British, once again without enough military personnel, used the Japanese to take care of the Viet Minh. The British counteroffensive used Indian and Japanese troops to retake Saigon. In the following days, and on October 29th, the British command formed the Gate Force, a task force that included Indian infantry formations, artillery, armored units, and infantry battalions. The Japanese, who fought the Viet Minh in several extremely violent battles, inflicted hundreds of casualties on the Vietnamese revolutionaries. And in January 1946, Ho Chi Minh decided to withdraw from all the cities and take the rest of the Viet Minh with him. What was left went into the jungle to wait for the situation to change somehow. After that, the first French military contingents began to arrive, as you can see here in this photo, French commandos being greeted by Japanese soldiers. And only in May 1946 were these Japanese soldiers in Vietnam repatriated back home. In 1945, there were 1.2 million Japanese soldiers in China. And at the time of surrender, these soldiers were very afraid of Chinese reprisals, since they had been at war with the country for more than 10 years. But the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek, ordered his soldiers to treat the Japanese soldiers well. Why? Because Chiang Kai-shek wanted to have immediate access to the Japanese army's arsenal in China. Let's remember that the Japanese army in China was indeed victorious and had launched successful offensives even at the beginning of 1945. And they maintained this situation until they received the order to surrender. Another objective of Chiang Kai-shek, by avoiding mistreatment of Japanese soldiers, was precisely to prevent these soldiers from joining Mao Zedong's communist forces. Since the Chinese Civil War had already resumed immediately once Japan surrendered, and even so, a survey from April 1949 indicated that 60,000 Japanese soldiers were fighting in the communist ranks in the Chinese Civil War. But besides avoiding mistreatment and speeding up the repatriation of the bulk of the Japanese troops in China, Chiang Kai-shek also used many high-ranking Japanese officers as his own military advisors. The most prominent among them was General Naosuke Tomita, shown here in this photo with Chiang Kai-shek and his political leadership. In Taiwan in the 1960s, Naosuke Tomita had been the chief of staff of the 23rd Japanese Army in China. But despite the violent years of conflict between the two nations, Chiang Kai-shek and Naosuke Tomita formed a very lasting partnership. General Tomita was, in fact, the last commander of the Japanese ground forces. The final phase of the Chinese Civil War in 1949, Tomita, founder of the so-called White Group of Political Military Advisors of the new Republic of Taiwan, would even take on a Chinese name, establish permanent residence in Taiwan, and would die in 1979 in Tokyo during his vacation. The last major group worth mentioning is that of the Japanese prisoners, who invaded Manchuria in August 1945. In total, 760,000 Japanese soldiers were sent to prison camps in the Soviet Union, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia. And these were used as forced labor in various projects in that region. including 200,000 prisoners who worked on the expansion of the Trans-Siberian Railway. These prisoners went through extremely inhumane treatment, with malnutrition, unsanitary conditions, cold, and diseases. And official Soviet numbers indicate that 60,000 of them died in captivity. However, comparative surveys of the total number of captives versus the total number of people who returned to Japan indicate that the number of deaths in captivity may have reached 350,000. Even though the overall situation was quite bad, Japanese prisoners of war benefited from the fact that their image was not associated with the various war crimes that were committed. States, as was the case with German prisoners, so their mistreatment was gradually eased. In the following years, and between 1947 and 1948, more than 350,000 of these prisoners had already returned home. The repatriations continued until 1950, when only 3,000 soldiers who had been accused of war crimes remained in Soviet captivity. And after Stalin's death in 1953, several amnesties gradually released this number of prisoners. The last large group was released on December 23, 1956. After that, only 1,025 Japanese remained in Soviet captivity, being released in small groups, until the last prisoner was only released in 1990. Many of these last Japanese who remained in the Soviet Union ended up starting families in the country and refused to return to Japan once they had the opportunity. As for those millions of soldiers who actually returned home, they were often received coldly by their compatriots, and in many cases the families of these soldiers were completely taken by surprise by their return. Since it was the habit of the imperial government to report the soldier as dead once he had been taken prisoner by the Americans. Again, this was to avoid the so-called shame of being taken prisoner for the guy's own family. There was also the case of the war criminals, especially the Class A war criminals who were tried at the Tribunal for War Crimes in the Far East, and of the 28 defendants who were tried in this process, with emphasis on General Hideki Tojo, former Minister of War and Prime Minister of Japan. 7 were sentenced to death by hanging, including Tojo himself, and another 16 were sentenced to life imprisonment. Of those 16, 3 died in prison, and all the others were pardoned. Starting in 1954, other Class B and C war criminals were tried and sentenced in other Asian countries, such as India, China, and the Philippines. And then there's one last very interesting case that deserves a specific video just for it. It's the case of the Pacific Stragglers, who were soldiers that continued their resistance decades after the end of the war, between 1947 and 1974. No less than 127 of these soldiers were found in various Pacific territories, some of them even being killed in clashes with local military and police forces. In 1974, 29 years after the end of the war, the last 2 stragglers were found in the month of March. Lieutenant Hiru Onoda was found in the Philippines, and in December, soldier Teru Nakamura was found in Indonesia. And a curious ending to this whole story is that Hiru Onoda immigrated to Brazil and became a cattle rancher there in the Pantanal. Want to learn more about this story? Buy my book, The Atom as a Weapon, available on WeClap and Amazon. And if you like this video, share it with your friends and give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe to Sala de Guerra so you don't miss out. I'll wrap it up here, and thank you again for watching. A big hug from Sala de Guerra.